Hello, welcome back to the channel. Let's go on with a bit of boring stuff. That's German value-added tax. It's a long time ago then since the last video has been uploaded here. And for today, there is some remarks due on general basics because the one or other among you might have forgotten them, or perhaps you are a beginner who just want to inform himself or herself about value-added tax as the first tax you deal with. And so let's give you, oh my God, brain is gone already. Let's give you some information on general basics. What we plan to talk about now is no tax without a law, who is allowed to make laws concerning VAT, types of tax legislation, probably then also methods of interpretation of the law and the hierarchy of different legislative texts, so that you are again familiar with all that. So let's begin in the beginning. A tax, ladies and gentlemen, means nothing else than to take away someone's money without giving them anything in return. That's the difference to a fee or a contribution. I think you remember that. And that has even been defined legally in the German legal order in paragraph 3 of the General Tax Code of the AO, the Abgabenordnung. And when you look on that without any prejudice, then just forcing somebody with violence to give away a bit of his or her property without giving that person anything back, that comes pretty close to theft and robbery. And now stealing and robbing is usually everywhere prevented by law, or at least not prevented successfully, but at least forbidden or prohibited by law. And now if the state wants to do it, or if someone wants to do it, there is a basic principle. What is forbidden by law can only be made allowed again by another law. Only by a change in the law, only by a legal command, you can allow something which is otherwise forbidden by law, because nobody is above the law. So as a result, we end up with a very simple conclusion. Taxes can only be allowed where there is a law that allows such a tax. Now, naturally, what we never do is create an individual tax law for an individual person. That makes no sense. So you will have a general law, and that will define if-then clauses. If someone does this and this, or if somebody has this as a property, that person has to pay such and such tax. Well, now, this also makes clear how one can avoid a tax. If you do not fulfill the if condition, then the then consequence doesn't take place. So if the rule is, if you have a property of 100,000, you have to pay a tax of 1,000, then there is a very simple way to escape that tax. Avoid to have a property of 100,000. For example, stay poor. On the other hand, this way to evade a tax hurts you more than it hurts the state, and that is why most people do not act this way. And indeed, that seems to be the way to successfully set up a tax, that the if conditions and the then clauses are combined in a way that somebody who wants to avoid achieving or fulfilling the if condition does more damage to himself than comes out from, say, from avoiding the tax. Well, but the basic logic is always working this way. So we know again how tax in principle works. But now, as everything must be laid down in the law, we cannot only restrict ourselves to knowing and understanding the system and logic of the law, we must also get familiar with the tax law in detail. Because if something is not explicitly written down in the law, then a tax would not be allowed. So it strongly depends on the wording and possible message of the text of the law if a tax can be taken or not. Remember, if there is no legal permission to take the tax, it would be illegal to take that money away from you. On the other hand, if there is a legal command to take a certain amount of money away from you, it would be a breach of the law not to do it. So everything centers around the text of the law, and that is why we always deal with translations, at least, of legal text. Well, who is now allowed to write the law? This becomes then a very central question, naturally. Formally, for value-added tax, the German value-added tax law is created by the German Parliament, that is made up jointly by the representation of the population, the Bundestag, and the representation of the federation states, so the Bundesrat or Federal Council. So we can call the two together the German legislature, so the Bundestag plus Bundesrat. That is allowed to make all kinds of tax laws, as far as the Constitution does not explicitly forbid them, and the Constitution usually does not forbid to levy taxes. So formally, the Bundestag is also competent to issue the German Umsatzsteuergesetz, that is the German Act on Value-Added Tax. Yeah. Under the formal aspect, that's simply true. And indeed, every line of the German VAT Act has been written by Bundestag and Bundesrat together, or to be more precise, has been decided upon by them, because usually the drafts for the legal texts are presented to the Bundesrat by the federal ministry and is not drafted by themselves. Now, in reality, things are a bit more complicated, because there's also the European Union, and the European Union is allowed to write European Union directives, which mean they give a binding command to the member states. And such directives are allowed everywhere where harmonizing or even unifying the legal rules on a certain matter is important for the functioning of the European single market. For taxation, the requirements for deciding or for adoption of such a directive are higher than in other fields of legislation, especially they require a 100% majority in the representation of the fiscal ministers. But Article 113 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union explicitly says and regulates that indirect taxes can be harmonized by directives. Now, these directives are, as I said, binding commands to the member states how they have to design their laws, that certain details ordered by the directives have to be implanted into every member state's legislation. So they are not a law in themselves, but they have the consequence that all member state laws will be in line with what these directives order. So the member states are only free to choose their own solutions concerning questions where such a directive is not yet existing, and where the EU directives do not regulate the matter directly or indirectly. Furthermore, the EU can also issue their own laws, so-called EU regulations. These are legal acts which are completely identical with what we call a law on the national level. So an EU directive can create directly obligations and rights for you and me, for the citizens. So if something is stated in an EU regulation, there will be no further national legislative activity necessary to bring it into effect. It is just effective just immediately, so it's a full law and has to be obeyed by everyone in all the member states. Now, you perhaps know that when you have two legislating bodies, first the national parliament, in our case the Bundestag plus Bundesrat, and on the other hand the EU, these two have a kind of concurrence or competition or a conflict of interest, because they must decide which matters shall be decided by the European Union and which shall be decided by the national parliaments. And with the integration getting stronger and stronger already in the 1990s, there has been a new principle introduced into the European Union treaties. That was the principle of subsidiarity. By the way, it was proposed and strongly pushed and supported by the British. So the problem should have gone, but the principle stayed in the treaty. The subsidiarity principle said the European Union legislation is only allowed in and for matters where a centralized legislation can achieve a better overall outcome than if the member states deal with the question themselves. Yes, and in the field of value-added tax, that has always been the case, that one said there must be a certain harmonization. On the other hand, the subsidiarity principle also implies that it's preferable to issue directives, because then the member states still retain the competence to write the text of the law and to decide some remaining open questions on their own. And so up to now, there has been the feeling that up to now, a uniform identical text, so an EU regulation on value-added tax, has not yet become necessary. So we find the rules on value-added tax which were issued by the European Union in European Union directives. In the course of time, that began with 1967, in the course of time, the amount of details which were regulated by such directives became more and more dense, and one tried to avoid a mass of directives. So the last important directives, the sixth directive on value-added tax from 1977, was more and more changed and enlarged and so on. And in the end, one had the feeling that the whole legal texts had become very, very confusing. And so a complete re-edition, a recast of the value-added tax directives was issued in 2006, with basically a collection of all the directive orders which had been given up to that time. So the value-added tax system directive from 2006 is a comprehensive collection of all what, or of nearly all, there are some details regulated in other directives, but for the bulk of all the VAT questions, everything is now collected in the VAT system directive from 2006. And if something is changed, that directive is adjusted to the change. Furthermore, later there was felt the need to regulate some details, and to regulate them in a uniform way throughout the EU, so that for clarification of some details, the EU issued a VAT implementation regulation. And so there, mostly, you have binding orders with direct legal effects, how certain doubtful questions have to be seen by all the member states and all citizens and all courts throughout the EU. So that's rather strange constellation. The basic text is a directive and does not have a binding legal effect, so the member states can form their own legislation, and they shall have to do so. But with regard to these doubtful cases, we have an immediate and a binding regulation in a regulation. When we have a look to what is left over for national free decision in the field of VAT, well, you cannot really give percentages. You can only feel how much is regulated by EU law and how much is left over. But you can say, if you want to describe the amount which is left over for national different legislation, you can say 90 to 95% of all questions of VAT law are decided on EU level by directives and sometimes by the regulation, and only very, very small details are at the moment still left over for national decision. That makes sense, evidently, because if you look to the history of the VAT system in Europe, they began with very, very small harmonization. For example, with the decision everybody should take a value-added tax system. And then more and more details required a uniform or at least harmonized design throughout the EU, because they found out, okay, the differences between the legal rules in the different member states constituted grave problems for cross-border trade. And so usually the attitude of all the ministries is we are against any uniform decision. Then they are faced with the problems and then they leave and agree on a further harmonization of another detail. So the directive grew and grew over time under the pressure that the economic situation just demanded such a coordination. Well, so at the present state of events, the fiscal ministries have been used to the fact that nowadays one simply cannot regulate important aspects of value-added tax alone anymore if one is a member state of the European Union. They have been used to the fact ineffective legislation on VAT matters can only be made on the European Union level. And that brings us to the conclusion that the competence of Bundestag and Bundesrat, so of the national parliament or of other national parliaments for value-added tax, remains mostly on paper. They have the task to write the final text of the national law, but they are no longer allowed to decide on most of the details. Only a very few details remain in their competence. One of them is to decide about the national tax rates. This is still an important difference, but many, many other things, for example, if something can be taxed with a reduced tax or not, that is already regulated in a uniform or harmonized way under the directives. Well, okay, so we have already got now some idea about EU legislation and have been reminded of the difference between a regulation, a EU regulation, and EU directive. Now, in German national law, you can also distinguish different forms of legal rules. The most important one is naturally a law, a tax act. A law can directly create rights and obligations for everybody. That means what is in the VAT Act is binding for citizens and for officials and for courts. Laws are made by the legislating bodies. That means in Germany by Bundestag alone or by the federal parliament Bundestag with consent of the Federal Council, the Bundesrat, depending on the situation. Then there are also government regulations, which are something which correspond to something which in other legal orders sometimes is called statutory instruments or so. The German word would be a Verordnung, and such a Verordnung or government regulation or statutory instrument, sometimes also called ordinance or so, is similar to a law. It has the full effect of a law in that way that it is absolutely binding for everybody. So it creates rights and obligations. But the difference to a law is a government regulation is not made by the parliament, but by the government with the permission of the legislator. So you will sometimes find details where the parliament says that it will not go and bother with regulating these details itself. It allows the government to decide on its own what they regard as adequate solution for such detailed problem. Under the German constitution, a government regulation is only allowed if in the law there is an explicit permission which kind of questions may be decided by government regulation, and that permission must be given previously and clearly described in the law, so clearly defined, so that every judge can find out when it comes to applying the government regulation, if the government regulation is still within the allowed field of legislation which Parliament has handed over to government. Due to historical experience with Germany, which Germany made in the 1930s, government regulations can, under the Constitution, only be allowed for strictly limited questions. Typically, regulations are issued or are allowed to questions like which proofs can, for a certain given fact, the administration demand, which formal requirements for registration in the books or so. These are usually details which Parliament often leaves to regulations. Yeah. Now, on EU level, naturally, we know there are EU directives and EU regulations. I told you already for both, you need on the EU level, if it is on taxes, a 100% majority in the Council. On the other hand, as the agreement or the procedure to issue EU directives and EU regulations on taxation is a very old procedure and a special one. Here something has survived, which was the regular mode of legislation in the beginning of the EU in the 1950s, because there you needed unanimous approval by the Council of Ministers, and on the other hand, Parliament only has to be asked for its opinion. They cannot strictly prevent new legislation on taxation. They only have a right to be informed there. So it makes sense to memorize as important technical terms and to be familiar with the terms EU directive, EU regulation. national law and government regulation. Also, one should know and combine a certain concrete idea with the European Union VAT System Directive, with the VAT Implementation Regulation, with the German USTG, that's the German VAT Act, and with the German government regulation on VAT, that would be the Value Added Tax Implementation Regulation, or in German Umsatzsteuerdurchführungsverordnung, that would be USTDV. Last but not least, everybody should also have at least vague idea of the existence and the functions of the following institutions which are involved in legislation. The European Union Commission, as you know, is the only institution on the European level which has the formal right to present a draft legislation to the European Union Parliament and the EU Council of Ministers. So it is never possible for Parliament or the fiscal ministers to create new legislation on VAT on their own. Naturally, what the ministers can do, and they often do this, they can suggest to the Commission that it would be nice if the Commission would present a draft legislation according to their wishes to them, and in other issues than Parliament also, in other issues than taxation also to Parliament. The Council of Ministers, ladies and gentlemen, naturally is nothing else than the assembly or a meeting, a regular meeting of all the persons who in the member states hold the office of fiscal minister. So if we have 27 member states, then naturally we have 27 ministers in the Council of Ministers. And as you perhaps know, the Council of Ministers always takes place as a meeting of those ministers who are under national law competent for the decision on the question which is to be decided. So if there is to be a debate, or if there is to be taken a decision on a question of traffic or so, then the ministers for traffic will meet. If there's something to decide on taxation, then the Council of Ministers will sit just in the form of all fiscal ministers of the member states. EU Parliament, on the other hand, is an elected representation in direct elections, and there you have a period of 5 years for which they are elected and sit, the same with the European Union Commission, whereas naturally the fiscal ministers in the Council have no fixed term of office, because how long they are members in the Council of Ministers simply depends on when their government is changed in the member state, or when they are fired or appointed by their leading prime minister or head of state. Also, on the German level, one should know Bundestag, so federal parliament, and Bundesrat, federal council. And naturally, you should also know that we have a federal government, which is of which the fiscal ministry is a part. Yeah. The German legislation can be found in the USTG, and I made a selective translation of important parts of that in the VAT Tax Act translation. That's a rather rough translation. I only translated the things which we need, and naturally this just is meant to convey to you the overall idea behind the legal rules. So probably somebody who does translations professionally will begin to cry and weep concerning the quality, but my idea is that probably you get a good overall impression what is meant. And yeah, what you also can find is the USDDV. There you could also, if it's possible for you, try to take a look. We have no translating problem, on the other hand, with the European Union legislation, because you know they exist. They exist in an official form in every official language of one of the member states, so that the VAT system directive exists in English too, and the same applies to the VAT implementation regulation of the EU, also that exists in English too. Good. Now, this already refers to another nice topic. How is the existing legal text to be interpreted? And please pardon me, that is something which we talk about in the next small video, which is, I hope, soon to come. Thank you very much for watching this video, and I would be glad if you show up again on this channel soon. Thanks and goodbye.